Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I am humbled to say a few words as part of this national apology today to people who've been affected by past forced adoption practices. To acknowledge many things, to acknowledge the extreme trauma inflicted on mothers and children from Australia's past adoption practices. To acknowledge that these practices were profoundly wrong. To acknowledge that children were taken from their mothers without consent. To acknowledge, worse still, that these children were taken with force and coercion. To acknowledge that women were intentionally degraded, lectured to, hectored, ignored, humiliated, lied to, drugged, in order to tear them from their infants. To acknowledge that these practices were also used to manipulate so-called consent from women. And I note that in Western Australia, women were rarely, if ever, told that they had legal rights, including the legal right to withdraw consent. It was a 30-day right. To acknowledge that this so-called consent was often thrown back in the faces of women to reinforce the idea that these children were unwanted. And to acknowledge the denial not only of that natural right, but of that legal parent-child relationship. To acknowledge that these practices have had deep, lifelong impacts on mothers, fathers, sons and daughters, and on whole families. These practices were immoral, unethical, and often unlawful, and the cause of deep and profound suffering. And today, with this apology, we recognise all of these wrongs. Today we say sorry. Today we apologise. I know that saying sorry cannot take away all of this suffering, but I hope that it can help many in our nation who've been affected by these practices to heal. I also hope it can help people to reach out, to help correct the record, to correct those long-held misbeliefs. The misbelief that these children were unwanted and unloved. I'd like to share with you a quote from Sue McDonald, who has bravely shared her story and was a brave campaigner for the apology in Western Australia, and she's spoken to me about her history. She said, "We were treated like animals with no feelings for the babies we conceived, carried, gave birth to and loved. We were viewed as little more than breeders, unpaid surrogates, fallen women who needed to be punished and rehabilitated by having our babies taken. We have lived with the injustice of knowing that the perpetrators of this abuse have been in large viewed by society as squeaky clean professional people, performing wonderful work in the community for finding perfect homes for children. Those that we supposedly did not want and abandoned. We have had 30, 40 or 50 years of living with the injustice of this general and sanitised view. And this view continues to colour our children's perception. Most believe they were abandoned, unwanted, unloved, and rescued by their adoptive parents." And I think this quote really unravels some of those perceptions today. It shows the difficulty that many people had in reaching out to reconnect family bonds because that was such the widespread prevailing view. And so I'd like to thank everyone who's helped lift the lid on this, those who were part of those practices, who helped unveil what had been happening in our institutions, but most of all to mothers and families who've bravely lifted their voices to help tell this story. As a child, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I grew up amongst a generation of young people taken from their mothers. As Senator Mackenzie said, you know, every classroom you were in, you would be with other young people who were adopted. And I know I've watched many of these friends and people I have known work hard to reach out, to reforge family relationships. And I really want to commend all of those who have struggled to put back together what the state and others broke apart, reaching out to find children, mothers, fathers and family. And I note with some sadness that for many affected by past adoption practices, contact vetoes still exist. Some people will pass from this earth without ever having met the kin that they were separated from. As a chair of a committee that inquired into adoption practices in Western Australia, I've had to look this issue squarely in the face to consider whether our adoption practices today meet the ethical standards that they should, and to reflect on the past adoption practices and indeed the failure of whole systems, including of legislators, to protect the rights of children, mothers and families, to protect their quite fundamental human rights. And while I cannot stand in the shoes of people who, because of family secrecy, because of shame inflicted by past practices, people who still feel that they need these contact vetoes, I can question whether it should be legitimate today to legally prevent someone from making contact with someone who is their parent or who is their child. So it is with great hope today that I hope this apology helps to dispel the myth that adopted children were unwanted or unloved, that mothers were unworthy or unfit. That with today's apology, we can continue to learn from this terrible past to ensure that these practices are never repeated. But most importantly of all, that with today's apology, we can help lift the veil of secrecy and sometimes shame so that people affected by past adoption practices can continue to reach out to each other and to affirm their family bonds.
Senator Pratt, would you like to seek leave to continue your remarks?
Would you like me to? Yes, I seek leave to continue my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pratt.